Gorilla witnesses giant python attack old lion. What happened next was unthinkable. The morning sun cast long shadows across the safari park near San Diego as Howard Ellison adjusted the strap of his weathered camera bag. His granddaughter's gift lay tucked beside his lens, a pristine photo album with blank pages waiting to be filled. "Fill this with the wonders you still get to see, Grandpa," she had said, her young eyes bright with hope and expectation. Since Margaret's passing 3 years ago, Howard had rarely touched his camera. The world seemed drained of color, emptied of the magic that had once compelled him to travel to distant continents in pursuit of the perfect wildlife photograph. At 74, Howard's joints protested the early morning chill, but muscle memory guided him toward the gorilla enclosure. These great apes had always fascinated him, their intelligence, their complex social structures, their uncanny resemblance to humanity's deeper nature. He settled onto a weathered bench beneath the sprawling acacia trees, watching as the troop began their morning rituals. The silverback, a magnificent specimen named Kibo, sat regally atop an artificial rock formation. His massive frame silhouetted against the brightening sky, his silver-tipped fur caught the light like precious metal, each strand a testament to his maturity and dominance. Around him, younger gorillas engaged in playful wrestling matches, their grunts and squeals creating a symphony of contentment that made Howard's lips curve into his first genuine smile in weeks. A female gorilla named Asha cradled her infant close to her chest, the tiny creature's dark eyes wide with wonder as it observed its world. The baby's fingers, so remarkably human-like, grasped at its mother's fur with instinctive trust. Howard found himself reaching for his camera, then hesitated. These moments felt too pure to capture, too sacred to reduce to mere images. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it a scent that made Howard's nostrils flare with recognition. Blood. The metallic tang was faint but unmistakable, triggering instincts honed by decades in the wild. His eyes swept the enclosure, searching for the source of this olfactory warning. The gorillas had noticed it too. Their playful banter ceased abruptly, heads turning in unison toward the eastern edge of their territory. Kibo rose to his full height, nearly 6 feet of pure muscle and instinct. His massive hands curled into fists as he surveyed the landscape with predatory alertness. The other gorillas gathered behind him, forming a protective formation that spoke to millions of years of evolutionary survival wisdom. Even the infant ceased its babbling, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Howard stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement. His photographer's intuition screamed that something extraordinary was about to unfold. He lifted his camera, though his hands trembled slightly, whether from age or anticipation. He couldn't say. Each step toward the source of disturbance felt weighted with significance, as if he were walking toward a moment that would define the rest of his days. The sparse vegetation beyond the main enclosure area rustled with movement. Howard's breath caught as he glimpsed something massive and scaled, moving through the underbrush. A python, but not just any python. This serpent was enormous, its body as thick as a man's torso, stretching what appeared to be 20 feet or more through the grass and low shrubs. Then Howard saw what had drawn the great snake, an aged lion, separated from the main pride, limping heavily as it sought shade beneath a cluster of thorny bushes. The lion's mane, once golden and full, now hung in patchy gray wisps around his weathered face. His ribs showed prominently through his tawny coat, and his movements spoke of years of battles, hunts, and the inexorable march of time. The python struck with lightning precision, its coils wrapping around the lion's torso before the great cat could react. What followed was a dance of death as old as nature itself, the serpent's crushing embrace against the lion's desperate struggle for freedom. Each breath became more labored, each movement more feeble as the python's coils tightened with mechanical precision. Howard's chest constricted as he watched the lion's eyes, once fierce and proud, now clouded with pain and confusion, in those amber depths. And he saw his own reflection, an old male, past his prime, fighting against forces beyond his control. The camera in his hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy, a burden rather than a tool. What was the purpose of capturing death? What glory existed in documenting defeat? The gorillas remained transfixed by the scene unfolding before them, Kibo's massive form tensed with each of the lion's struggles, his dark eyes never leaving the deadly embrace. The younger gorillas huddled closer to the adults, their usual curiosity tempered by an instinctive understanding of mortality. This was nature at its most raw, most unforgiving, the strong consuming the weak, the young replacing the old. Howard felt tears sting his eyes as the lion's struggles grew weaker. How many times had he witnessed scenes like this during his decades of wildlife photography? Death was part of nature's grand design, as essential as birth, as inevitable as the sunrise. Yet something about this particular struggle cut deeper than usual. Perhaps it was his own advancing age, his own increasing frailty, his own growing awareness that his time was limited. The python's coils continued their relentless constriction. The lion's breathing became increasingly shallow, labored gasps that seemed to echo Howard's own fears about his mortality. Here was the king of beasts, reduced to helpless prey, suffocating in the embrace of a creature that felt no malice, only hunger. It was the most honest representation of nature Howard had ever witnessed, beautiful in its brutality, terrible in its honesty. Kibo took a step forward, then stopped. His massive hands flexed open and closed, as if weighing some internal decision. The other gorillas looked to him for guidance, their body language tense with uncertainty. In the wild, intervention in another species' struggle was rare, almost unheard of. Each creature fought its own battles, survived or perished according to its own strength and cunning. Howard found himself holding his breath, though he couldn't say why. The lion's struggles had nearly ceased. The python's victory seemed inevitable, just another statistic in nature's endless ledger of survival. The old photographer prepared himself to witness death, to carry this image with him, as he had carried so many others, a burden of beauty and brutality that defined his life's work. Then something extraordinary happened. Kibo's chest expanded with a breath so deep it seemed to draw air from the very earth. The sound that emerged was unlike anything Howard had heard in 5 decades of wildlife observation, a roar that transcended mere vocalization and became something primal, something that spoke to the very foundations of life itself. It was a sound of defiance, of refusal to accept the unacceptable, of rebellion against the natural order. The silverback charged. His massive form moved with surprising grace and speed, covering the distance to the struggling pair in seconds. Behind him, the other gorillas followed, not in the chaotic rush of panic, but with the coordinated precision of a military unit. Their movement was purposeful, deliberate, as if they had discussed this moment in some language Howard couldn't understand. What followed defied every principle Howard thought he understood about animal behavior. Kibo seized the python's tail with both hands, his muscles straining as he fought against the serpent's incredible strength. The python's head whipped around, its jaws gaping to reveal curved fangs. But the gorilla held firm, using his body weight as an anchor. Another gorilla, a large male named Django, attacked the middle section of the python's body, his powerful hands working to pry loose the coils around the lion's ribs. A female joined the effort, her smaller but nimble fingers working at the loops around the lion's neck. Even some of the younger gorillas participated, grabbing whatever section of snake they could reach and pulling with all their strength. The python fought back with desperate fury, its body thrashing like a living whip, but it was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The gorillas worked with an intelligence that bordered on the supernatural, each one focusing on a specific section of the serpent's body, creating a coordinated assault that the python couldn't counter. Howard stood frozen, his camera forgotten in his hands. His mind struggled to process what he was witnessing. This wasn't just unusual animal behavior. This was a complete rewriting of everything he thought he knew about interspecies interaction. Gorillas were not known for their altruism toward other species. They were typically focused on their own troop's survival, indifferent to the struggles of other animals. Yet here they were, risking their own safety to save a creature that, under normal circumstances, they would avoid or flee from. The python was easily capable of killing any one of them, yet they pressed their attack with unwavering determination. It was as if they had made a collective decision that some principles were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The python's coils gradually loosened as the gorillas maintained their relentless pressure. Howard could see the exact moment when the serpent realized it was defeated. Its body went rigid for a moment, then began to withdraw with the fluid motion of liquid defeat. With a final, coordinated heave, the gorillas separated the python completely from the lion. The great snake, sensing its disadvantage, slithered rapidly away into the dense undergrowth, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The gorillas stood panting heavily, their chests heaving with exertion, forming a protective semicircle around the motionless lion. For a terrifying moment, Howard thought they had been too late. The lion lay completely still, his sides unmoving, his eyes closed. The compression from the python's coils had been severe, and the elderly cat had been struggling for several minutes before the gorilla's intervention. Howard felt his heart sink, a crushing disappointment that surprised him with its intensity. Then the lion's chest moved just barely, but unmistakably. A rasping breath escaped his throat, followed by another, slightly stronger. His amber eyes flickered open, clouded with pain and confusion, but undeniably alive. The great cat's gaze moved slowly from one gorilla to another, as if trying to understand what had just occurred. Howard's vision blurred as tears spilled down his weathered cheeks. He hadn't cried since Margaret's funeral, had thought his tear ducts permanently dried by grief and age. But the sight of the lion drawing breath, the impossible beauty of what he had just witnessed, cracked something open inside his chest that he had thought permanently sealed. The youngest gorilla in the group, barely more than an adolescent, approached the recovering lion with cautious curiosity. The big cat's head lifted slightly, and for a moment, predator and primate regarded each other with something approaching mutual respect. The young gorilla extended one long finger and gently touched the lion's shoulder, not in aggression or dominance, but in what could only be described as concern. The lion didn't flinch or snarl. Instead, he seemed to accept the touch, perhaps recognizing it as the gesture of a savior rather than a threat. The moment stretched between them, a bridge across millions of years of evolutionary separation, a connection that transcended species barriers and spoke to something fundamental about the nature of compassion. Howard lowered his camera completely, realizing that no photograph could capture the true essence of what he had witnessed. This was beyond documentation, beyond art, beyond any category of human experience he could name. This was a glimpse into the divine machinery of existence, a moment when the universe revealed its hidden mechanisms of grace and redemption. The other gorillas gradually relaxed their defensive posture, though they remained close to the lion as he slowly struggled to his feet. His legs were unsteady, his movements careful and painful, but he was alive and conscious. The great cat looked once more at his unlikely rescuers, then began to limp slowly toward the denser vegetation where he could rest and recover in privacy. Kibo watched the lion's departure with something that looked remarkably like satisfaction. The silverback's chest swelled with a deep breath, and he released a soft vocalization, not a roar this time, but something closer to a sigh of contentment. His troop gathered around him, and they began to move back toward their preferred area of the enclosure. Their mission accomplished, Howard remained rooted to his spot long after the animals had dispersed. The afternoon sun was climbing higher, casting new patterns of light and shadow across the landscape, but he barely noticed. His mind was reeling with the implications of what he had witnessed. In his decades of wildlife photography, he had captured countless moments of natural drama, but nothing had prepared him for this. This wasn't just an unusual animal behavior. This was evidence of something profound about the nature of consciousness, empathy, and moral choice in the animal kingdom. The gorillas had made a decision that went against their own self-interest, that put them at risk for the sake of a creature they had no biological imperative to protect. They had acted not from instinct or conditioning, but from something that could only be called compassion. The implications staggered him. If animals were capable of such altruism, such moral reasoning, what did that say about the nature of consciousness itself? What did it mean about the barriers humans had constructed between themselves and the rest of the natural world? Howard had spent his entire career observing animals as subjects, as beautiful but fundamentally different creatures whose behaviors could be cataloged and explained through scientific principles. But what he had just witnessed couldn't be reduced to simple behavioral categories. It was evidence of something far more complex and mysterious. The existence of moral agency in creatures that science had long classified as operating purely on instinct. The gorillas had chosen to act heroically, and that choice revealed depths of consciousness that Howard had never imagined possible. As the day progressed toward afternoon, Howard finally began to walk slowly back toward the main visitor areas. His legs felt unsteady, not from age but from the emotional impact of the morning's events. He passed other visitors, families with children pointing excitedly at various animals, couples sharing quiet moments together, all of them completely unaware that they had just missed witnessing one of the most extraordinary events in the history of interspecies interaction. Howard wanted to stop them, to tell them what had happened, to share the miracle he had witnessed. But he knew they wouldn't understand. How could he explain what he had seen in a way that would convey its true significance? How could he make them understand that the boundaries between human and animal consciousness were far more permeable than anyone had ever imagined? Instead, he continued walking, carrying his secret like a sacred trust. The blank photo album his granddaughter had given him remained empty. But Howard no longer saw this as a failure. Some moments were too profound to be contained in photographs, too sacred to be reduced to images. They could only be carried in the heart, preserved in memory, and shared through the inadequate but necessary medium of human language. That evening, Howard sat in his small apartment near the safari park, the events of the day playing and replaying in his mind like scenes from an impossible dream. He had always been a man of science, someone who believed in observable facts and measurable phenomena. But what he had witnessed challenged every assumption he had ever made about the nature of consciousness, morality, and the invisible connections that bind all living creatures together. The phone rang, and he heard his granddaughter's voice, bright and cheerful, as always. "Hi, Grandpa, how was your day at the park? Did you get any good pictures for the album?" Howard found himself struggling for words. How could he explain to this young woman, so full of life and possibility, that he had witnessed something that challenged the very foundations of how humans understood their place in the natural world? How could he tell her that her simple gift of a photo album had led him to the most profound experience of his 74 years of life? "I saw something remarkable today," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something that reminded me that the world is still full of wonders I never imagined possible." "That's wonderful. Grandpa, did you photograph it?" Howard looked down at his camera, which had remained untouched since the morning's events. "No," he said softly. "Some things are too beautiful to capture. They can only be experienced, remembered, and treasured." After hanging up the phone, Howard walked out onto his small balcony and looked toward the safari park in the distance. Somewhere out there, an old lion was resting, recovering from his ordeal, probably unaware that his rescue had fundamentally changed how one elderly photographer understood the nature of existence. Somewhere out there, a troop of gorillas was settling down for the night, having acted with a nobility that would have been remarkable in humans and was absolutely extraordinary in animals. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and Howard found himself thinking about Margaret. She had always believed that the universe was far more mysterious and wonderful than human science could ever fully comprehend. She had often told him that his photographs, beautiful as they were, could only capture the surface of reality, that the true magic lay in the invisible connections between all living things. Howard had always smiled indulgently at such talk, attributing it to Margaret's romantic nature rather than taking it seriously. But now, after witnessing the gorilla's heroic intervention, he understood that she had been right all along. There were forces at work in the world that transcended scientific categories, connections between creatures that defied rational explanation, and sources of compassion that emerged from depths of consciousness that humans were only beginning to fathom. As he prepared for bed that night, Howard felt a peace settle over him that he hadn't experienced since before Margaret's death. For 3 years, and he had felt adrift, purposeless, as if his life's work had been rendered meaningless by loss and age. But the events of this day had shown him that meaning could emerge from the most unexpected sources. That wonder was still possible, even in the twilight of life. He thought about the young gorilla's gentle touch on the lion's shoulder, in that moment of connection that had transcended millions of years of evolutionary separation. In that touch, he had seen the future of human understanding about the nature of consciousness and moral agency in the animal kingdom. Scientists would study these behaviors for decades, trying to understand their implications for evolutionary biology, cognitive science, and philosophy. But Howard knew that the true significance of what he had witnessed couldn't be captured in academic papers or scientific journals. It was something that had to be felt rather than analyzed, experienced rather than explained. It was evidence that the universe was far stranger, far more wonderful, and far more interconnected than most humans ever dared to imagine. The next morning, Howard returned to the safari park with a different purpose. He no longer came as a photographer seeking images to capture, but as a witness to the ongoing miracle of existence. He spent hours observing the gorillas, noting the subtle ways their behavior had changed since the previous day's events. There was something different about their interactions, a heightened awareness that suggested the rescue had affected them as profoundly as it had affected Howard. Kibo, the silverback who had initiated the rescue, carried himself with even greater dignity than before. His movements were more purposeful, his gaze more penetrating, as if the act of saving another creature had awakened something deeper in his consciousness. The other gorillas seemed to defer to him with even greater respect, recognizing that he had led them in something extraordinary. The young gorilla who had touched the lion's shoulder appeared to be searching for something in the distance, perhaps hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature they had saved. There was a restlessness in the youngster's behavior, a sense that the rescue had opened new questions about the nature of their world and their place in it. Howard began to spend entire days at the park, not photographing, but simply observing, trying to understand the subtle changes he was witnessing. He brought notebooks instead of cameras, recording his observations in careful detail. He documented the shifts in the gorillas' social dynamics, the new patterns of behavior that seemed to emerge in the aftermath of their heroic act. Other visitors began to notice the elderly man who sat quietly for hours, watching the gorillas with intense concentration. Some assumed he was a researcher or scientist conducting some kind of study. Others thought he might be an elderly zoo volunteer who had formed a special connection with the animals. No one guessed that he was simply a man who had witnessed a miracle and was trying to understand its implications. Weeks passed, and Howard's notebooks filled with observations. He noticed that the gorillas' play behavior had become more cooperative, less competitive. Their grooming rituals had expanded to include more members of the troop, suggesting an increased sense of social cohesion. Most remarkably, they had begun to show increased interest in other species within their viewing range, as if their successful intervention had awakened a new awareness of their responsibilities to the broader community of life. Howard also noticed changes in himself. The chronic depression that had plagued him since Margaret's death began to lift. He found himself sleeping better, eating with more appetite, taking interest in aspects of life he had ignored for years. The blank photo album remained empty, but Howard no longer saw this as a failure. Instead, he had begun to fill notebooks with detailed observations and reflections on what he had witnessed. One evening, as he sat writing in his apartment, Howard realized that he was creating something far more valuable than any photograph could have been. His detailed account of the gorilla's rescue of the lion, combined with his careful observations of the behavioral changes that followed, represented a unique documentary of interspecies altruism that could contribute significantly to scientific understanding of animal consciousness and moral behavior. He began to research scientific journals that might be interested in publishing his observations. To his surprise, he discovered that documented cases of interspecies rescue behavior were extremely rare and highly valued by researchers studying animal cognition and social behavior. His account, written from the perspective of a trained observer with decades of wildlife experience, could provide valuable insights that purely academic researchers might miss. Howard contacted several universities with strong animal behavior programs, sharing preliminary accounts of what he had witnessed. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Researchers who had spent their careers studying animal cognition were fascinated by his detailed description of the gorilla's coordinated rescue effort and the behavioral changes that followed. Within a month, Howard found himself collaborating with a team of primatologists, ethologists, and cognitive scientists who were eager to study the gorilla's behavior in more detail. His notebooks became the foundation for a comprehensive research project that would eventually contribute significantly to scientific understanding of moral behavior in great apes. The research collaboration gave Howard a new sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer just an observer of nature, but an active participant in expanding human understanding of the natural world. His unique position as a witness to an extraordinary event had transformed him from a retired photographer into a citizen scientist, making meaningful contributions to academic research. The blank photo album remained empty, but Howard no longer saw this as a symbol of his decline. Instead, it had become a reminder that some experiences are too profound to be captured in traditional media. They require new forms of expression, new ways of sharing knowledge and understanding with others. As autumn approached, Howard began work on a book that would combine his detailed observations with broader reflections on the nature of consciousness, morality, and the connections between all living creatures. The project gave him a sense of urgency and purpose that he hadn't felt in decades. He was racing not against death, but toward a deeper understanding of life's most profound mysteries. The gorillas continued to fascinate researchers who came to study them. The behavioral changes Howard had first observed proved to be lasting and significant. The troop showed increased cooperation, decreased aggression, and heightened awareness of other species changes that persisted long after the initial rescue event. It was as if the act of saving another creature had permanently altered their understanding of their place in the world. Howard often thought about the moment when Kibo had made the decision to charge toward the struggling lion. What internal process had led the silverback to override millions of years of evolutionary programming that would normally have kept him focused solely on his own troop's safety? What combination of intelligence, empathy, and moral reasoning had culminated in that split-second decision to act heroically? These questions went to the heart of fundamental issues about the nature of consciousness and moral agency. If animals were capable of making ethical choices that transcended their immediate self-interest, what did that suggest about the continuity between human and animal consciousness? How many other examples of such behavior had gone unobserved and undocumented throughout history? Howard's book project expanded to include these broader philosophical questions. He began corresponding with philosophers, theologians, and ethicists who were grappling with similar questions from different perspectives. The gorilla's rescue of the lion became a case study in discussions about the nature of moral behavior, the origins of altruism, and the possibility that ethical reasoning existed throughout the animal kingdom. The work energized Howard in ways he hadn't experienced since his early career as a wildlife photographer. Then, and he had been driven by the desire to capture beauty and drama in single, frozen moments. Now, he was motivated by the goal of understanding the deeper patterns and meanings that connected all living creatures in webs of mutual dependence and possibility. As winter approached, Howard reflected on how completely his life had changed since that morning when he had witnessed the gorilla's heroic intervention. What had begun as a simple attempt to fill a photo album had evolved into a profound exploration of consciousness, morality, and the hidden connections that bind all life together. The old lion had survived and, according to park veterinarians, had made a remarkable recovery. He had been observed interacting peacefully with other animals in ways that were unusual for elderly male lions. It was as if his brush with death and subsequent rescue had also changed something fundamental about his understanding of his place in the community of living creatures. Howard often watched the lion from a distance, noting the calm dignity with which the great cat carried himself. There was something different about his bearing, a quality of acceptance and peace that seemed to reflect an understanding of how narrowly he had escaped death and how unexpectedly salvation had arrived. The lion's recovery had become as remarkable as the rescue itself. The collaboration with university researchers had yielded several published papers that were generating significant interest in the scientific community. Howard's detailed observations, combined with follow-up studies of the gorilla's behavior, were contributing to a growing body of evidence that moral reasoning and altruistic behavior were far more common in the animal kingdom than previously believed. The implications of this research extended far beyond academic circles. Environmental ethicists were using the gorilla's rescue of the lion as evidence for expanding legal protections for animals based on their demonstrated capacity for moral behavior. Animal rights advocates found in the story powerful ammunition for their arguments about the continuity between human and animal consciousness. Howard felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that his witnessing of a single, extraordinary event was contributing to broader changes in how humans understood their relationship with other species. The blank photo album had led not to images but to insights that were reshaping scientific and philosophical understanding of consciousness and moral agency throughout the natural world. On the first anniversary of the rescue, Howard returned to the exact spot where he had witnessed the gorilla's intervention. The safari park had installed a small plaque commemorating the event, and researchers from around the world had come to study the ongoing behavioral changes in both the gorilla troop and the rescued lion. Standing in the same place where he had watched the drama unfold, Howard felt a profound sense of completion. His life had been divided into two phases before and after witnessing the gorilla's heroic act. The first phase had been about capturing moments. The second was about understanding their deeper significance. The blank photo album still sat on his desk at home, its pages as empty as the day his granddaughter had given it to him. But Howard no longer saw those blank pages as representing failure or missed opportunities. Instead, they had become a symbol of the limitations of traditional ways of documenting and understanding the natural world. Some experiences, Howard had learned, were too profound to be captured in photographs. They could only be fully appreciated through careful observation, thoughtful reflection, and the patient work of understanding their implications for how humans understood their place in the web of life. As the sun set on this anniversary day, Howard felt a peace settle over him that went deeper than contentment. He had been privileged to witness something extraordinary, and he had found ways to share that experience that honored both its immediate beauty and its broader significance. The gorillas were settling down for the evening, their behavior still showing the subtle but permanent changes that had resulted from their act of heroism a year earlier. The rescued lion was resting peacefully in his preferred spot, and his recovery complete, but his dignity enhanced by his experience of both near-death and unexpected salvation. Howard packed his notebooks carefully, knowing that his work was far from finished. The book project continued. The research collaboration was yielding new insights, and the broader implications of what he had witnessed were still being explored by thinkers around the world. But as he walked slowly toward the park exit, Howard carried with him the most important lesson he had learned from that extraordinary morning, that the world was far more wonderful, far more mysterious, and far more interconnected than he had ever dared to imagine. The blank pages of his granddaughter's album had led him not to images, but to understanding, not to documentation, but to wisdom. In the end, that was the greatest photograph he had never taken, the understanding that some moments were too sacred to capture, too profound to contain, and too important to reduce to mere images. They could only be lived, understood, and shared through the inadequate but necessary medium of human connection and communication. The gorillas had taught him that heroism existed throughout the natural world, that moral reasoning transcended species boundaries, and that the capacity for altruistic action was woven into the very fabric of consciousness itself. These were lessons that no camera could capture, but that would influence human understanding of the natural world for generations to come. Howard Ellison walked home that evening, carrying within him the memory of an extraordinary day, the satisfaction of work well done, and the peace that comes from understanding one's place in the grand tapestry of existence. The blank album had become, in its emptiness, the fullest document of wonder he had ever created.